Over
So,
to
it is a
Tiago.
pleasure to participate in the Discography Tag 2024, although not physically. My paper will focus on a case study, early music record production in Portugal, and on some challenges I had to face working with discography in this particular context. A very small field in already very small and peripheral Portuguese record music industry. That was the subject of my research in the last decade, including my PhD between 2015 and 2020, that focused on a historiographic approach to this context, taking the discography as a primary resource. As we know, over the last decades there was a growing musicological output about the history of the recording industry and on recordings as a source for different fields of studies, namely classical music. In Portugal, the studies on recordings start to receive greater attention from the academic community only in the last 2 decades, which has already increased our perspectives around music recordings as a relevant element for historical and scientific research. But although there aren't many discographies, which in fact is a field that got very small attention by Portuguese musicologists. Up until the moment I start to collect information for the discography for my PhD, there were only 2 discographies published about classical music in Portugal. The first one was started by Luísa Cimbron and Joaquim Carmelo Rosa, devoted to records of Portuguese repertoire and published in the Portuguese Journal of Musicology for the first time in 1992 and updated in the following years. As the authors explain in an initial note to that discography, in 1992, I quote, "In the present panorama of Portuguese musicology, there seems to be a complete lack of works on discography, which is undoubtedly a field of great importance for the knowledge of our music. This article is a first approach to the subject." End quote. In 2003 was published a second discography in book, this one by Julia Miguel Bernardes and Isabel Bernardes, within the same framework as Cimbron and Rosa's discography, but exclusively taking in account CD releases and not considering music by unknown composers. This is critical for repertoire before the 16th century and a real problem when we are dealing with early music. These discographies documented for the first time a large number of recordings of Portuguese music, but they also have a great number of what we may call natural gaps, mainly due to the sparse resources available on this subject and due also to the fact that there was not an archive in Portugal dedicated to recordings. On the other hand, they are not set up as critical or historiographical studies to the point of seeking to find information to complement the data printed in the sources themselves. Therefore, for my research, the first challenge was always going to be to try to fill in some of these gaps in order to complement that previous information on discography and try to correct some misinformation. The discography I worked on focused on commercial recordings with pre-romantic repertoire recorded in Portugal since 1957, the year of the oldest recording in this scope, until 2015, when I began collecting the information from the discographic sources. In addition to the basic reference information, like title, performers, date, label, catalog number and format, I needed to gather more information to be able to answer the main questions I raised for my research. I needed to collect more data, especially about the production teams and other participants, such as the authors of the liner notes, for example, but also about the repertoire recorded, the recording venues, and the sponsors. This was of the most importance to do the discological work that, for example, allowed me to discuss production models, the financial dynamics of different publishers in different periods, to identify producers and engineers who were more or were less involved and how, and also the distribution of the different repertoires in this discography. But I also needed a tool that would allow me to collate all this information and compare it. So I developed a concise database very useful for my private work. The data collected was organized in a way to make it possible to search by each of the fields or through a general search, while at the same time making it possible to filter the information or cross-reference the existence of the same work, the same performer, or other fields among other possibilities. All sorts of things we expect an interface like this can do today. This proved essential for analyzing the data and drawing up sampling plans to support the results of this research. The information for each record includes cover image, title, publisher, with an indication of collection or series when it is the case, participants, performers, producers, sound engineers, among other roles, repertoire, type of repertoire, year of release, catalog number, original format, type of edition, recording location, recording date, sponsors, and the field for notes and observations. Having commercial recordings as a primary source in this context is not an easy task, as besides the small amount of previous and solid discographies, the record industry in Portugal, namely classical music, is not much organized, and there isn't any specific institution devoted to centralize the information about record releases. To deal with this, I adopted a wide range of methodologies both from historical musicology and ethnomusicology, the study of related bibliography and similar research projects, collecting and analyzing critically the data of the discographic sources, the comparative study of recordings, which was a very effective way to correct wrong information on repertoire per track on some few discs, or other cases in which we have an indication of repertoire attributed to a certain composer and which, in the meantime, musicological research has managed to review that authorship. Also did a lot of research on the internet, media archives, labels and musicians' documentation, record stores, periodicals, fieldwork and also interviews. And let me highlight here the interviews because it proved essential in a case study such as this, where we are working on recent times and we have not a considerable scientific production on the subject, but at the same time we have the opportunity to contact and consult directly with some of the people involved in this history. Without these interviews, we lose a wealth of information that is crucial to our historical knowledge and that are relevant to fill in some gaps. One example among many was in relation to a set of 3 albums with Spanish early music belonging to a series published by the Spanish government, which at first glance would not meet the framework of this discography because they were labeled as recordings that took place in Spain. These albums were recorded in 1971 by Santiago Kastner and his group Ministérios de Lisboa, pioneers in the early music movement in Portugal. Both the original LP edition and 1990 CD reissued had no booklet information about where they were recorded and about the recording team. Kastner was a key figure in the Iberian musicology and during several years divided his life between Portugal and Spain. So it will be natural for him to have recorded in Spain. However, the rest of the musicians were his Portuguese colleagues and students. So I tried to verify the possibility that these recordings had taken place in Portugal, and this was confirmed through a couple of interviews, namely an interview with keyboardist Cremildo Rosado Fernandes, who took part in these recordings and confirmed that they had been commissioned by the Spanish government but were recorded in Portugal by Portuguese technical teams, which opened up the possibility of 3 more recordings for this discography and for the knowledge of the activity of these performers in Portugal. Other main challenge was the access to a surprisingly number of sources. Surprisingly, having in account that we are talking about recent releases from the last decades. Some of them didn't figure in those previous discographies, and there were other ones that, even being documented in printed sources or in the internet, were difficult or even impossible to access. And you would expect the oldest recordings to be the most difficult to access. But in fact, there is a great amount of records already from the 21st century that are no longer available, and there are others that are not even known or listed in the archives of the labels. And why is that? To find an answer, or at least part of it, we need to take a quick look at the development of classical music record production in Portugal and at the different moments that I was able to establish precisely in my PhD research. These 4 periods marked by different dynamics of production. And to conclude, that there was a transformation from an industry led by majors or big national companies to a context dominated by indies, almost exclusive, especially from the beginning of the 21st century. The production and editorial structures that were dominant between the 50s and the 90s were surpassed by recording projects run by small independent companies such as Audiopro, Numérica, Altum or Resonare Records, along with labels belonging to cultural societies like Edições MP or artists' labels like Mu Records. The early music catalogs in Portugal that are still publishing today were all created already in the 21st century. Having this panorama in account, there are 2 obvious conclusions. A clear inconsistency of the record labels throughout this history, largely due to the fact that most of the Portuguese early music catalogs were centered on the initiative of a particular producer at a particular time, and that it has tended towards a dispersion of publishing entities, mostly independent and increasingly smaller and of diverse nature. These changes are one of the main reasons for this dispersal of information and this difficulty in accessing sources. Many labels are so small and have such a short existence and such a small number of releases with a proportional distribution that today it is very difficult to access copies. One example is a collection called Museu dos Sons, Museum of Sounds, which included 5 volumes with early music. This collection was widely distributed in 2002 as a supplement to one of Portugal's main newspapers, named Público. The label, Resonare Records, was a very small indie run by a single person, the producer João Ludwig, was only active in the first decade of the 21st century and ended due to not being financially viable, as a lot of other similar projects. It has no distribution today, there are no copies available, neither in the newspaper's archive nor from the producer whom I interviewed, and I've only managed to put my eyes in this collection in a small peripheral library. We are talking about discs that, about a decade before my research, have been massively distributed in thousands with a big national newspaper. But there are also recordings from bigger companies such as Valentim Carvalho, the main Portuguese record company of the 20th century, the Portuguese representative and publisher of EMI, with some titles practically disappearing shortly after being published. For example, a series of CDs published by Valentim Carvalho in the EMI Classics catalogue in 1994 as a reissue of a pioneering Portuguese early music collection called Lusitana Música, which had been originally released in the 70s in the His Master's Voice catalogue. By the end of the same decade, this CD's reissue had almost disappeared from distribution, and today it is almost impossible to find any copies in any archive. Another example is a record also published in the Portuguese catalogue of His Master's Voice, which I only had access to through the internet second-hand used records market. It's a recording of clavichord music by a Swiss musician, Bernard Brochely. This one was recorded in Portugal and released in 1987 and hasn't been in distribution for many years and is not listed on the archive of the label itself. I remember, the largest Portuguese record company. Nor did I find this disc in any of the many private archives and collection I was able to consult. Allied to that, there is a certain negligence in the preservation of recordings in Portugal, and that is the other main part of the problem. In fact, it wasn't until 1976 that an initial working group was set up to create a Portuguese Phonograms Institute with a national recording library. But it never really happened. The Lisbon Phonothèque was created in the 90s, but even today it lacks the resources to be able to do a proper job, and only recently, in 2019, was finally created the National Sound Archive that is still in the work phase of the Installation Commission, and it is not clear that it will have the function of an official phonographic archive for, ideally, all the old and new editions. In conclusion, this makes it very challenging to do research on recordings in such a context. Anyway, the wide range of information that was possible to collect from these sources proves their importance for the historical knowledge of musical life in the last 100 years. In 2018, when I finalized the data inventory, I reached a total of 335 editions, almost the double of titles from the ones identified until the start of my research, and bringing together a rich scope of information. To achieve this, it was essential to break the idea of a division between the methodologies seen as specific to historical musicology and those of ethnomusicology, and on the contrary, to favor the fusion between these two fields, which is increasingly crucial in research with this framework, and only in this way was it possible to reach several unprecedented conclusions that resulted from this research. This allowed me to widen the knowledge about the context of classical music in Portugal in this period, as well as about predominant figures whose contributions were less well known, the dynamics of the production of early music in this period, and to put on the map a very valuable heritage to Portuguese music history. The challenges of this research tells us that even the preservation of recent sources is not guaranteed, especially in a context like this one, and that we may run the risk of lose information of our own time that will not be known by later generations if it is not collected and studied today. At the same time, this research proved to be of great utility to help some of the recording labels themselves and their archives. I know that this paper brought questions that many of our colleagues have probably already experienced in some of their research, and already, of course, much discussed or even obvious, but I also know that it is never too much to bring these challenges to light as a way of building a critical forum of common research that is increasingly consolidated around recordings studies. Thank you very much for your attention.